It's now a great pleasure for me to introduce the next event, Artists at the Forefront of Social Movements, with two artists I greatly admire, Dred Scott and Samia Halaby, moderated by my dear friend Barbara Pollack, also my co-founder at Art at a Time Like This. Barbara Pollack is a co-founder and co-director of Art at a Time Like This. She's a writer and a curator and has raised visibility for artists from unrepresented communities and emerging art centers since 1990. After the panel, we'll go again to a Q&A, so we hope that you can join the conversation again.
I'm so thrilled and honored to be having a conversation with these two great artists tonight. The question, before we begin any project, we ask the question, how can we think of art at a time like this? We are certainly living in a world that's very challenging at the moment, very dreadful in many ways, and yet how can we think of art at a time like this is not to dismiss art as secondary to politics, but to think of this as an opportunity to rethink art so that we can address some of the issues that people are facing today. These two artists, their work does not visually look the same, but they have much in common, including that both of them are represented this year at Venice. Samia in the show Foreigners Everywhere in the Giardini, and Dred with a satellite pavilion, the All African Peoples Consulate. Samia Halaby, if you don't know, is a prolific visual artist considered to be a trailblazer in contemporary abstract art globally. In her renowned paintings, which have been collected by international museums since the 1990s, she was the first female associate professor at Yale University and is considered a thought leader in the field of Arab art, Arab contemporary art. Born in Jerusalem in 1931, she was displaced from Palestine in 1948 with her family when she was 11. From this experience, she has not only made art, but also written some of the foremost texts on Palestinian art, including her 2002 survey, Liberation Art of Palestine. A major homecoming exhibit at Indiana University, planned for 3 years, was abruptly canceled in December by the university. I'll let Samia tell you about that in a minute. Now let me introduce Dred. Born in 1965 in Chicago, Dred Scott is world-renowned visual artist whose works go to the heart of the causes of repression, making everyone who sees them a bit uncomfortable. In 1989, his art became the center of a national controversy over its transgressive use of the American flag while he was still a student at School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm sure he has more to say about that. No stranger to forces of censorship, in 2019, Dred presented Slave Rebellion Reenactment, a community-engaged project that reenacted the largest rebellion of enslaved people in U.S. history. The project was featured in Vanity Fair, the New York Times, Christian Amanpour on CNN, and highlighted by Artnet.com as one of the most important artworks of the decade. So, to begin, each of you, could you talk a little bit about what the question, how can we think of art at a time like this, means to you?
Before talking about censorship, and we're going to talk about censorship, I think it's important to look at and think about the context in which our work is being censored in. And this is that the world is intolerable. You talked a little bit about that. You know, there's a tiny handful of people that controls the great wealth and knowledge that humanity as a whole has created. But it doesn't have to be this way. That is causing tremendous suffering. But the people can make a radically different world, and I think a world without exploitation and oppression, and change themselves in the process of making it. But to do that, we need revolution. Coming up against that, though, there's this oppressive regimes. And the work that is being censored, we need to look at who's censoring it and why. And so, you know, it was really great to hear Shireen mention, Tumaj Salahi, this great, Iranian rapper who's sentenced to death for standing with woman life freedom. So, in one place of the world, that's what's happening. In the United States, one of the biggest things that's being censored is the 1619 Project, and for challenging a white supremacist view of history. And one of the biggest things being censored right now is anything that is pro-Palestinian or against genocide. And if you're the rulers of this, planet, who see nothing wrong with burning children alive in their tents, they're terrified that people will actually question their legitimacy and question this whole system. And so that's where artists' work comes in. So my work has been censored across many decades, but I think it's important to look at this particularity of the works being censored and realize that they're actually fundamentally not trying to censor my work. They're trying to actually stop people from changing the world. And so with that, let's have a brief overview. I don't know if they're showing, they had some slides on my work. I don't know if, yeah, so we've got what is the proper way to display a US flag. This is an artwork that's an installation for audience participation that invited people to question what the US patriotism and the US flag is. And it was censored and challenged by none other than President Bush himself, which I thought was a tremendous honor, and it was outlawed by Congress. You see it's outlawed by Congress. And what does one do when one is faced with an unjust law? Well, one defies the law, so I and other people burned flags on the steps of the US Capitol, burned American flags, and that became a Supreme Court case. Let's see what we've got up next, if we can get to the next slide, hopefully, come on. All right, excellent. This is a work called Blue Wall of Violence, which talked about murder by police, and it actually was censored and threatened with censorship when it was shown right around the corner from here at the MOCADA, the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Art. Police unions were threatening the show from the minute it opened, and basically the people who worked at the museum, the director and the curator, basically needed escorts and bodyguards to come and go from the project, and the police union publicly called the work really terrible, which I thought again was an honor. And what do we have next? We got and this is the police stopping me in the midst of a performance called Money to Burn, where I was standing on Wall Street and burning money a bill at a time, 5, 10, 20s, and singles, and encouraging others with money to burn to join me and to add their money to the fire. But the police thought there was something tremendously wrong with that, so they intervened and stopped the performance. And let's go to the next one. And this is just a great headline I wanted you to see. Police, headless cops stir a ruckus at a Brooklyn culture show. This was a piece in the Memorial Arch at Grand Armory Plaza that was threatened with censorship, and because it actually looked at the question of revolution in the United States. And one last image, we got to go one more. And this is a man was lynched by police yesterday. It's work from 2015 that became the center of some controversy in 2016, especially when it was shown at Jack Shainman Gallery. Basically, there were death threats and bomb threats phoned into the gallery for showing this work, and he was threatened to be evicted for presenting it. And so that's just a quick overview. We can hopefully talk about questions like this as we go.
Yeah. Samia, would you like to give a little?
Of course. First, I want to introduce my dress. I think my dress comes from the Americas, probably Central or South America. It was given to me by a dear friend in Beirut. So somehow or the other, wearing it here, I brought it home to where it belongs. If someone knows where it comes from, please inform me. I would love to know. But the reason I'm wearing it is to honor the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and South America as well, both Americas. And thank you. And my reason for that is because I've been Instagramming. And I saw a woman from one of the tribes of North America, and I wished I remembered, but it was too late, and I was so impressed. And then you pass by the Instagram, and then you never find it again. But what she was saying really moved me deeply, and it was not different from what a Holocaust survivor was saying, and other people were saying about Gaza and what happened in Gaza. So the people who informed us about what's happening in Gaza, or Gaza in Arabic, were the Gazawis themselves, who were broadcasting the information on in video and distributing it to the world as loud as possible, as clearly as possible, as widely as possible. And to this woman who was speaking, she was grateful for that, because she had now seen what had happened to them, but it wasn't photographed. And a Holocaust survivor felt the same way. He said, I support all these broadcasts. I want to see more of them. I'm seeing what happened to us, but it wasn't documented. So to me, all of the work that was done by these young people is documentary art. And it is this one woman of an indigenous tribe in North America or Canada or South America somewhere that alerted me to this benefit that Palestinian resistance, which has been going on for decades. And in fact, one of the things that really makes me feel good is I'm wearing it for another reason too. We tend to, when we're an oppressed minority here in America, we tend to say, okay, you don't like us, let me show you how much I am who I am. And so you see young African Americans, well, in my day, I saw my contemporaries wearing prints from Africa, shirts and pants, and I saw Palestinian, and we wore the kufiyya all over that has its own history. Maybe I'm going too long. I'll cut it short very quickly. So the fact is that instead of wearing my own, I'm exchanging, I'm deflecting, I'm bringing somebody else's dress to the fore. And so this is part of what's happened to the Palestinian flag. And I put it on my Instagram. It started out as a flag of resistance, a banner of resistance of a group in Syria against oppression that was colonial. And then the Palestinians adopted it. It's not our flag by ancient right. We just adopted it. And now the whole world has adopted it. And I give it to you. We Palestinians give it to you. Make it the international flag of revolution. What I see is a society internationally that is dividing. It's like cell division taking place. And there are going to be those soldiers who are doing those awful videos and bragging about killing Palestinians, both female and male Israeli soldiers. You know, they're happy. They put them out with a smile and pride, and that's because they have an audience. So when I'm saying we're polarizing, there are people in our neighborhoods who adore those posts that we think are so horrible. So I just want to bring that fact to the fore, that we live in a dangerous society at a dangerous time. It's polarizing. It's great optimism. It's beautiful. I love it. And I love the young people, and especially the unions who are doing what they're doing. So
Thank you.
That's what we do in times of
Thank you
war.
so much.
I thought that you were talking about the polarization that's existing between people who are reveling in genocide and proud of that, and those who are resisting that, and not necessarily lamenting that polarization, but sort of seeing it as, okay, terms are becoming clearer. I mean, we obviously wouldn't want people, or the people in this room and you and I wouldn't want people who are celebrating murder and celebrating genocide, but it's good that we know that that's how they feel, and hopefully we can be revulsed by that and strengthen the other side of polarization. That is, and so I think you were saying that this polarization that's happening is a threat to democracy, and I think, well, actually part of the thing is the people who are looking at and staring at genocide, the people who are looking at and staring at fascism being put in here. We need to not try and say, oh, let's convince fascists to be better people. Well, no, I mean, that's, but we do actually need to find the ways to defeat them. So.
Yeah. So, Dred, when you talk about with art, that what they're objecting to is not the artwork or you, the artist, but the information they don't want to get out into society, How do you structure your work to reach an audience despite the fact that you always run into these obstacles?
Um, you know, I think that this is, as I said, a polarized world, and people feel very passionately about, various important social questions. So if or right now, if you're making work that talks about, say, women generally or abortion, there are going to be some people who very much think women are human beings and should have access and right to control their body and reproduction, and other people who want to control women. If you're, and we'll feel very passionate about that. If you want to talk about, police murdering people, there's some people in this society who think there needs to be more of that the police need to do more of that and be unleashed to do that. And that's, why there are a lot of people who are inspired by Donald Trump. And then there are other people who are like, no, we don't want the police shooting us down and roaming our neighborhoods and terrorizing our communities. And so I always look at the people who are opposed to oppression and think that's my audience. And when I want to make work about important social questions, I'm not that worried about the people that, phone in death threats or send me death threats. I mean, I pay attention to it, but I'm really trying to reach the people who are actually not on that side of the equation and would be inspired by somebody saying, yeah, the police are the inheritors of lynch mob terror. I now understand something more about the history and continuum of this country and thinking about how we might get free.
And as artists, oppression, you encountered the police, you've encountered politicians, but also the institutions, the art institutions are often part of the problem. And so, Samia, I'd love you now to talk about what happened to you this year.
Well, I think, first of all, I want to just one little point to confirm what Dred is saying, is that polarization is not something we control. And I learned that during my interviews with Palestinian artists. When the revolutionary storm comes, or when revolutionary winds blow, you realize you're just a tiny dot in this world, that the society, the community around you who is in revolution, not the ones who are against it, is really the power at hand. That's why we respect and hope for unions to come and help us in Palestine more than anything else. So this process is a natural process. We can't control it as individuals by wishing it. Back to your particular question, I'm not trying to avoid it, but these general principles are very important. When you look at any institution or any political party, or even this organization, BRIC, you have, I don't know much about them, so I shouldn't include them, but you have the administration, and you have those who are under the administration. You have people who are, hope unionized, who are cleaning this room every day, or the tech workers. And you have a unit that is part of society. And that's what is an educational institution. You have the students, you have the lab technicians, you have the workers, you have the professors, and so on. And those, this is a valuable institution that mustn't be threatened. So when I criticize them, I make it clear that it's the administration I'm criticizing. So the Indiana University administration was cowardly. The Michigan State University administration is sitting there confused what to do with Samia Halaby. But the Indiana University really decided to just cancel the show Helter Skelter. They didn't care what happened. It cost them a lot. But there were earlier presidents at Indiana University who resisted such pressure from the government. They did not have to concede. They could have gone down to the students and talked to them openly, as did actually the president of Michigan State University, went down to the tents and talked to the students. And I hope he has the brains to actually follow through on his promises and actually proceed to disclose and divest. I love their statements. I love what they call, they're not going to stop, etc. Disclose, divest. So I hope he follows through. So this is the situation. I think Indiana made a huge mistake. And I'm sad to see that the university suffered a little bit for it, but I don't feel like lying about anything. It's inappropriate. So, and the young people are the most important ones.
But I think the public has also suffered because of what Indiana University has done. I mean, this was your first major retrospective, right? That was, I mean,
In the
your-
US,
in the
yes.
US, that's what I'm saying.
In the Midwest.
Including the Midwest, where you kind of grew up, right? I mean,
Yeah,
or not. I
For
mean,
my older teenage
yeah,
years,
yeah.
yes.
So it would have been an important kind of homecoming for you and celebration of you, who's this tremendously important abstract Palestinian artist, to have that work shown, especially right now, somewhat an accident of now, but that would be really, really important for the public to see and to engage with, and that's not possible there. I mean, it's going to the Broad, is it? Or
Yes.
yeah, which is really good. So the show has not been completely suppressed, but it would be really important, and so it's, I think, indicative of the times we live in, that the cowardice that you talked about extends. I mean, you know, it's like, it's one thing when they come after and censor my work. I mean, my work is openly part. Your work is actually dealing with abstract questions, and, you know, questions of Saturn, questions of space, I mean, it's really interesting. And that, I mean, that engagement of somebody who's dedicated her life both to sort of an activism and causes around, you know, liberation and freedom, especially of Palestinians, and scholarship around that, but also pushing abstract art in interesting ways, which is often what artists are told, well, oh, you're from an oppressed people, you should be making art like Dred Scott, you shouldn't be working, you know, doing abstraction.
Yeah.
I think it's really great that you're doing that and have consistently done it for decades, and yet we now in Indiana aren't able to see that. So could you talk about that?
Well, if I talk about that, let me start with saying, Dred, I don't think there is such a thing as art. When I heard someone earlier talking about you shouldn't take art as a what is it, career or whatever, I am a painter. I took up painting and I was intent on being a painter. No one wanted me to be a painter, at least not in the area of the commercial art world, which includes everybody, including critics, museums. I put them all together. You know, they have power over us. We have no power. We decide nothing. They have all the economic power. We have zero. We can try, but we can't get anywhere without a gallery to protect and take 50% of our income. So let's be truthful about it. So, but I wanted to be a painter, and I decided I'm the artist, not them. And so I continued and continued and continued. For 50 years, nobody paid attention to me at all. I tried here in New York. Oh, I tried, but it was no good. Being a Palestinian and female and maybe a little bit brown, I guess, just did not cut it. What they're threatened about right now is the fact that I'm Palestinian, and I'm accomplished, and what you notice they did in Iraq and what they did in Gaza is called murder, assassinate all the intellectual people. They did that very carefully in Iraq, and they do that, if they can't assassinate them, they do that to African Americans and any other group. And what's more, they will adapt and adopt intellectuals who are black, who are Palestinians, who are Indian, who work at their big universities, who buy into them, and they buy into them, and they have them. They're the intellectuals of India working at Columbia University. So we don't see the real intellectuals. We don't see the real thinkers of Palestine because they've got a Palestinian intellectual in their pocket. So those are the many ways in which they use us. But back to art very quickly. I think what I do, I call research. I'm exploring the language of abstraction. I'm not going to stop by just doing that. I have a skill. People come and ask me where's Palestine in my work. I make documentary art as well. And I make posters and banners that speak my mind. I'm not going to put them in a painting because then it's no longer an explorative painting. But I also, so I do all these things.
Yes, I think it's important also in this is that one reason we paired the two of you is because people have a notion of what political art is. And they think of it as didactic or graphic, and yet you two explore the political using very different aesthetics. And Samia, I read that you take very seriously the beginning of abstraction and the Russian constructivists, and that was one of your launching points.
It's true. I've rewritten art history for myself, frankly, because it just wasn't any good. It just simply, I remember the book we studied from when I was first, second year when I was teaching at Indiana University. I noticed one of the books was by someone called Jansen, was called World Art. How many pages did it have on all of Asia? Did anyone count them? There's 1,000 pages in the book, and there are 10 on all of Asia. And that's the world. So obviously it had to be rewritten. So I reconstructed the theory of art for myself so I can see what abstraction is, where it came from, what does it mean, and therefore I see, for example, what is called Islamic decoration as being an image that is a picture that is abstract, is three-dimensional with time as the third dimension. And then from there, I see abstraction coming in with Impressionism as they begin to use the general as a principle. And then I see it in the Soviet artists, I see it in the Mexican revolutionaries, and I see it in American abstract expressionism. Those to me are the highlights that I follow as the art of that is my ancestry that I want to build on.
And Dred?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, I grew up in Ronald Reagan's America, and I tell people Ronald Reagan made me a communist, which it's true. I mean, and the thing is, so you're young, you're grappling for ideas of why the world is the way it is, and how can you make it different, and can it be changed? And at the same time, you're learning. You're in school, you're trying to learn how to make art, and I had the Jansen book too, and there were like literally 20 pages on Africa, and we skipped those. and so it's I'm looking for who has done this kind of work. And actually, I mean, talking about the Soviet constructivists, I mean, that was like, I was interested in that. I didn't want to make that work, but it was work that came out of revolution, and that was like, that's really interesting to me. Mm-hmm. And so I was looking for, how do you make work that talks about this world full of mountains of oppression? And I had to search for it because it was skipped in a lot of the art history I was spontaneously fed. But then I found artists like Hans Haacke and photographer Roy DiCarava and artists like Leon Golub. And then I also looked at who was doing it, not necessarily just in visual art, but Toni Morrison became really important to me, and the musicians Public Enemy and NWA, Fight the Power and Fuck the Police, were really important as I was trying to figure out what do I want to do in visual art. But this grounding with like seeing what Hans Haacke did, I didn't want to do institutional critique, but I did see, oh wait, the audience can be part of the artwork. That can, for some people, they paint with oil on canvas. I do audience and use the audience as an active audience as an element of my artwork and the engagement of the audience. Or I can actually then think about community engaged artwork as performance, but still rooted in not just talking about what some other artists who were doing social practice were, but I actually said, well, what are communities that are poor and oppressed in New Orleans? What do they need to get free? And that's how I can do something like Slave Rebellion Reenactment, which reenacted the largest rebellion of enslaved people in U.S. history with 350 reenactors on the outskirts of New Orleans in an area it's Klan country, but walking with sort of people with machetes and muskets and sickles and sabers, talking about freedom both in the past but now. And so it is this trying to figure out what speaks to ordinary people, but it talks about some of these big questions on the foundation of, well, I was trained in an art school and I took those tools, much like Samia did, to do what I wanted to do. And that was to actually, serve people trying to get free but make the work accessible with an understanding of, oh, here's how Public Enemy kind of broke it down in that form for those same people. I want to do that with visual art.
Great. My final question for you, before we take questions from the audience, has to do with impact. Do you feel it's the artist's job to make an impact? And if you do, how do you judge that for yourself?
I want to talk about the impact of his name. And I've just gotten introduced to Dred Scott's work. I'm very impressed. And to me, first I make a very quick preamble so I don't take too much time. To me, postmodernism has been the bourgeoisie choosing something to put down modernism. You know, you have constructivism, you have deconstruct, you know, and we had abstraction, and now we're going to do Western ideals, and they have this idealist philosophy in most of the content. Then you've got artists who use that language from Palestine, from other oppressed nations like the African-American nation within the US, who put their own language in it, and they completely raise the language into heights that that the original creators never imagined for it. So, you know, then I read his name and I go, well, what is, I grew up in American high school for the last 3 years, so
you learn nothing.
So I knew there was something called Dred Scott decision, but I wasn't sure if it was an uprising or a court decision. So I went to read, and I started thinking, you know, this decision that became a blight on the judicial branch. And I started thinking, here, there's the law. And there is, throughout history, there are laws we remember that are famous. We know Hammurabi's law, etc., from pre-ancient history. And then I know that there's no law that we live by that doesn't have enforcement. They go together, the law, enforcement. We are forced to live by the law of those who rule in this country. There's enforcement. We've seen them be very brutal on the campuses recently. And they were very brutal during the Vietnam resistance, etc. Anytime 9/11, they get brutal again. Then we see it, but they're always brutal. They're always killing the bright kids who are African American or from other lesser groups, minority groups, excuse me. So here comes Dred Scott's decision, and a man who is saying, we white people don't want to give black people citizenship. So, but they don't own the land. So what are they talking about? You know, the land, they stole the land. So some thieves have established a law and a police system to say to a certain group of immigrants, you can't be citizens. You go from there, then who's a citizen here? And who has the right to give you citizenship here? And what is this citizenship and borders between countries that we're running around in? Aren't we finding an internationalist atmosphere growing? Should we not think about who's a citizen here or who's a citizen of the world? You know, it just keeps getting more and more complex as you think about it. So I think the name you chose was brilliant. You know, you're bringing questions in that are very huge, especially to someone who knows American history. But also I admired very much your work on inspired by the Palestinian posters. So maybe you want to talk about that.
Well, thank you. And I'll talk briefly about that. So it was a project that I did called Never Forgive, Never Forget, They Left Us to Die, which was done after the people got left to suffer and die in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans being flooded. And, you know, part of it was that people were pinned in. The sheriffs of surrounding towns literally shot at people trying to cross a bridge. People were called looters, and the government was targeting them for trying to get, you know, insulin or getting Pampers for their kids. And over 3,000 people died, or I think it was about 5,000 ended up dying in New Orleans. And yet that was not memorialized. And growing up, when I was, beyond Ronald Reagan getting everything, I was inspired by the resistance to apartheid in South Africa and in the first Intifada. That was when I was young and learning about the world and how people fought back and were trying to get free. And so I knew that in Palestine, people used the deaths of their people as a part of the struggle to actually not let people be forgotten, but also to, make those lives count for something and those deaths count for something. And so these, so-called martyr posters were something that I found really interesting and thought it would be really great if people in New Orleans memorialized their dead that way, because these were political deaths, these were man-made deaths. The storm was an accident, but how people were forced to suffer and die was very much in the interest and service of this system. And I thought that I imagined that people would actually remember our people, coming from the streets, actually trying to remember and memorialize people who had been lost in the storm.
Yeah, I found them very beautiful and
Thank
very
you.
important. I did read them one by one and read the names. And yes, that's the effect of this poster. Which, do we have a minute for me to say, or we run out of time?
No, we actually, if we're going to take questions,
Okay.
but I would love this conversation to continue for another 2 hours, quite frankly. So.
Yeah, just first of all, thank you for sharing your perspectives on how to be vocal in a time of censorship. And my question comes about the theme of polarization and impact. Just to give you a bit of context to this question, I was at the MoMA on Sunday for an exhibition and came across the pro-Israel march. And outside the entrance, I couldn't really suppress my rage, and I screamed, "Free Palestine." And a whole swarm of phones filmed me, and they found me and tracked me down and are defaming me somehow, and all these things. But in that moment of rage, I just couldn't really hold myself back. And then I ran into the MoMA, and the head of security stopped me, and they said, "Excuse me, are you here to make trouble?" And I said, "No, I'm just here for an exhibit. I didn't know this would be happening." And they said, "Okay, because we're an opinion-free zone." And I was already kind of shaking, so I didn't quite know how to respond. But when I hear you all talking about how to, the work that you do having meaning and having impact, my first question is, when you create work, are you thinking about how am I going to touch somebody completely on the other end of my opinion? And have you ever had an experience where you did manage to communicate a message to someone totally on the other end of the spectrum? And my second question is, does it matter to you if that does happen? Is your work still valid for you? Just to have a voice, is just having a voice powerful enough as one person?
So first off, good for you for screaming "Free Palestine." That's the right answer, and I'm sorry that you're being doxxed, but all of us should be, it's like, the Canary mission has doxed me, and it's this Israeli-funded, billionaire-funded thing by the Israeli police to try and stop the movement, for pro-Palestine, and so it's terrible that people are on it. It's getting people to lose jobs and getting people to be terrorized, but people should be proud to be sort of thought of as an enemy of a terrible, oppressive government like Israel, and so. But on the question of impact, I don't make my work to try and sort of reach people who fundamentally disagree with me. It happens. So about a week ago, I just got an email from a guy who was a former cop, and somebody had showed him my work, and he, over time, came to actually appreciate what I was doing. I was actually surprised by this, and I take it as genuine, that he was sort of somewhat transformed, that he came to understand what the police do, especially to black people in this society, and was moved to see that he was kind of on the wrong side. And I'm sincerely appreciative of that he both felt that way, but that he wrote me, because he didn't have to write me. But I'm not mostly making work for people like that. I'm mostly making work both to talk about the world as I see it and hopefully having people that are sort of questioning the status quo both see their world reflected in my work, hopefully take joy in some of it, and hopefully have them see it in a new and different way. I mean, it's like people talk about preaching to the choir, and I think that the metaphor is, I'm not religious, but I think there's a reason why preachers preach to the choir, because they had to strengthen the choir. If the choir was singing off note, then you wouldn't get that message out there. And I think it's a good thing because a lot of people that I make work for, they don't necessarily agree that we need revolution. They don't agree that the cops, full stop, are agents of enforcement of brutality and relations of exploitation and that serve a system of oppression. They don't necessarily agree with the fact that America is fundamentally a terrible, monstrous place and that billions of people will celebrate when America is in the dustbin of history. But yeah, millions of people will. There will be people dancing in the streets. And so a lot of my audience doesn't necessarily have that opinion that I have, but then they do get challenged by, oh, wait, you're doing a slave rebellion reenactment, and that makes me a little uncomfortable, but I kind of like it. Or you're talking about how the police are the successors of lynch mob terror. That's a little extreme, but it's kind of true. And so those are the people that I'm trying to make work for and sort of bring them along with me as we collectively and collaboratively try and change the world.
Thank you. You want to say something?
For my artwork, when people want to ask me, who do you paint for, since I make my artwork an exploration of language and media, because I think all of the new things, revolutionary art internationally, historically, has done that, then I say the future. So very young people more than anyone else, I don't care who they are and what they'll think, and maybe I'll fail, but that's where my painting is. My documentary art is to document and preserve, so especially Palestinians, but all other people will know some of the things that happened to us. My book, Drawing the Kafr Qasim Massacre, falls in that category. I did a very careful search and research and was present in the village and made the drawings of a massacre that was not photographed. And my posters are to declare and threaten those who rule. Look, here's what I'm demanding. And the young people are demanding divest. So do I have my poster up there? Yes. This is step-by-step revolution, mobilization for total revolution to liberate both man and land. And we did that, not recently. That was done in 1971, I think, something like that. So at least it tells you some of the age of our resistance. Of course, it goes much earlier than that. So those are the three things. The impact I want to have is on my fellow demonstrators. We're together. We are one voice. We are one fist. We're stronger together. And here's what we're demanding. And we're threatening those who are not giving. We're demanding. And we keep demanding and demanding and demanding until we remove them from power and we take power. That's it. So that's where the political art should be. And it should express what you feel and think. I don't think my painting is about me. I don't think art is a personal expression. I think that's one of the propaganda tricks those who rule and educate play on you if you're an artist. Don't believe it. You're an artist, you look at society, you understand society, and you speak, whether they hear you or not, but you speak, and you speak their language, and you speak for them, not for you. You're not preaching them. I'm not preaching anyone when I do my abstraction. Some people come and recognize things in it intuitively, but it's not about me.
I have a question for Dred Scott. On your slave enactment, how was it received? Because now, in the context of Palestine, any discussion of context to aggression, not justification, just providing context, is vilified. So now you're coming to us with a story that is kind of aggressive, but historically, it's historical, so people can actually hear it. So I wanted to know how was the reaction to the...
Well, first off, just to be specific, it was not a slave reenactment; it's a slave rebellion reenactment. And I, you just heard about it the first time. I'm not upset, but I just am making it clear because one of the things is that people, at the time, some people thought, oh, well, this is going to be a traumatic experience for the reenactors because they're going to be embodying slavery, embodying enslaved people. And actually, they were embodying self-liberated, formerly enslaved people. It was a slave rebellion. And so there were a couple of audiences. Yeah. Yeah. The reenactors themselves were part of the audience, and that was a deeply transformative experience for them, marching for 24 miles over the course of 2 days, being part of this and embodying it actually even in ways that was unseen prior to that. But then the public, broader public, overwhelmingly supported and were engaged and interested in this piece. Because the thing is, that in that region, we did a lot of work in the community. I mean, it was a project that was visible for 2 days, but really took 7 years to do. And so we had town halls, we had sewing circles, we had other ways which we engaged the community. And while I know that there are people in these communities who are, say, white supremacists, because we would see the Confederate flag flying. There were people that have been bitterly opposed to what we were doing, but they were a relative minority, and they also commingle with all sorts of other people, including people who participated and their friends and families who didn't. There were school students that came out to see it because we passed by their schools. They really dug it. There was a woman that I will never forget that was living in a trailer. The towns are really super segregated by, well, both class and race, but there's literally a train tracks that separates one wealthy community or relatively wealthy community from a fairly poor community. And this woman lived in a trailer that was on her own land. It was her land. It was her trailer. She came out because she was so happy that people were telling this story and this history, which she didn't know, but it's like, this is my history, why don't I know this? And so it was inspiring to her, and there were a lot of people we encountered like that. And so I'm not saying that this was a universally loved piece. I know from seeing media coverage that there were some people who didn't like it, and in fact bitterly hated it, but again,
Was it because of the use of violence during the rebellion? They don't want to glorify that?
well, no, mostly it was because they're racist and they don't think black people should be standing up. That, I mean, to be literal and blunt, that's actually what it was. And it's like, if you go to my website, so dredscott.net, you can see there is a page about slave rebellion reenactment, and it has a video that The Guardian did. That is a really interesting video, and it has this, one sort of straight out of central casting, white supremacist, racist country, Bubba, that is, saying literally what some of them think. But he was the minority, but he basically thought, we, white people, gave black people a lot, and why are they talking about this history? Why aren't they just happy with where things are? And so, yeah, there were people that were like that. There were other people who tried to stop this, that were in city council members that actually wanted us literally pinned in because we had prop weapons. And they were like, but they had actual automatic weapons. And so it's like, why is it that black people with toy antique guns is a threat, whereas white people with machine guns and AR-15s are perfectly legitimate? And so it's, the questions of violence, I mean, it's like, yeah, there's a question of violence, but black people, particularly black women, who had violence often used against them, they felt it was liberating and inspiring.
Thank you.
I just want to say the word violence and the word hatred are ambient in in propaganda. And from now on, I would advise everybody when they think of violence, think of who's using it before you use it. There's a difference between the violence of the police and the violence of resistance. So Palestinian resistance is not violence. And from that point of view, I disagree with the decision of the court to, who has arrests out. Oh, we're going to be even-handed. Arrest a few from here and a few from there. And hatred. Yes, I have hatred. Hey, I would be abnormal if I didn't hate. I would be abnormal if I didn't feel feelings of violence towards those who are killing babies. No, I think always think of who's practicing the violence before you use those terms.
Very important.
And that uprising reenactment was phenomenal. You know, it reminded me of the Soviet Revolution when the Soviet workers decided to reenact the revolution. So long live the resistance.
Long live the resistance.